I've just seen the first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I've also seen that the New York Times has published an article fact-checking the first presidential debate. So what I want to do here is fact-check the New York Times' fact-check of the first presidential debate. And they actually have quite a few fact checks, so I'm just going to go through the first 20, and I hope I can kind of point out what I've seen as a representative problem with the New York Times fact check. So here's the first one. There aren't 100 million people with pre-existing conditions, and that's a fact stated by Donald Trump. The New York Times says it's false. The president was challenging a statement by Mr. Biden, and he said that there weren't 100 million people with pre-existing conditions. But actually, the New York Times says the Department of Health and Human Services estimated between 61 and 133 million Americans have pre-existing conditions. So I think right off the bat to just say, well, 61, the low end of their estimate, is less than 100 million. So that seems kind of like the official report is giving Donald Trump some wiggle room. Like, it's hard to say that this is flat out false if the official report says it's possible that, yeah, there are less than 100 million people. But I think it gets even worse for the New York Times if you actually look at this report they're talking about, and if you read a little bit of it. So on page 4 and 5, they talk about how their report has two different measures of saying what a pre-existing condition means. And it's a good idea to keep that in mind because, of course, a term like pre-existing condition could be, it could have different meanings to different people. You know, I might interpret it differently than you might, and we both might interpret it differently than an insurance company might, or than this government report might. So the government report says, this quote I have highlighted here, they're referring to the two different measures they have of pre-existing conditions. And the broad measure is what the New York Times quotes that says it's between 60 and 103 million people. The report also says, quote, the narrower measure is similar to that used in a recent Kaiser Family Foundation analysis, which finds that 52 million non-elderly would have been uninsurable in the individual market in most states before the ACA. The KFF study notes that its analysis does not attempt to include, excuse me, that's as far as I wanted to read. But the point here, 52 million non-elderly adults is a lot less than 100 million. And they are talking about people younger than 65 when they mention this. So again, it's very confusing to me that the New York Times would call this false because, one, even by the broad measure, 61 to 133, it's still possible to say that, yeah, I think there are less than 100 million people. And then two, maybe Trump was talking about the narrow measure, the measure that would get you rejected from coverage in the earlier healthcare regime. So I think it's really just better to say that this is ambiguous. We don't know what Trump meant when he said there aren't 100 million people with pre-existing conditions. Certainly by some measure, by some definition of pre-existing conditions, that's wrong. But by other measures, that's right. So I think if you were going to be harsh, you would say it's ambiguous. If you were going to be fair, you'd say, I guess that's true for some definition. That's one instance of the New York Times being pretty unfair to Trump, I feel. The next point is a quote from Joe Biden. It says, I was able to bring down the cost of renewable energy to cheaper than or cheap as coal and gas and oil. And the New York Times rates this as mostly true. And so this is kind of giving an example of how I feel the New York Times is being harsh on Trump and very generous with Biden. So they go on to talk about how renewable energy fared under the Obama administration. And they say this, it's pretty, stands out quite a bit to me. It says, it is accurate that in some particularly windy and sunny parts of the country, wind and solar electricity are now as cheap or cheaper than coal or gas. But fossil-fueled electricity is still cheaper in portions of the country that do not have wind and solar. So just think about the extent they went to say that Trump was wrong, to say 100 million people with pre-existing conditions, there aren't that many. They go, well, actually, if you take the high end, the broad estimate of this government report, yeah, there are that many, Trump, you're false. And then when Biden says, I was able to bring down the cost of renewable energy, they go, yeah, that's mostly true. Well, if you look at specifically some parts of particularly windy and sunny parts of the country, they are sometimes about as cheap as coal or gas. So that's mostly true. That seems like an absurd reach to me. If I were going to make the case that this claim was false, I'd say, one, actually the vice president doesn't really control the cost of renewable energy. The cost of renewable energy is driven by things like scientific progress that enable us to unlock new methods of generating electricity or greater efficiency of our solar panels. It's driven by things like, can we import cheaper solar panels from China? China had a boom developing cheaper and cheaper solar panels. And it's driven by investment in the renewable energy sector. It's driven by legislation, yeah, but the vice president doesn't control that. The vice president is largely a kind of symbolic or figurehead role. He doesn't have a lot of power, and he doesn't determine the cost of energy sources, either renewable energy or coal or natural gas. And then if I were going to be hard on him, I'd say that, and actually, yeah, renewable energy wasn't as cheap as fossil-fueled electricity. So I would just call this claim false. You didn't do it, and it didn't happen. Of course, the New York Times says it's mostly true. The next point, a solicited ballot is solicited, okay? You solicit, you're asking, they send it back, you send it back, I did that. If you have an unsolicited, they're sending millions of ballots all over the country, there's fraud. And the New York Times says this is misleading. And this is actually something they do quite a bit. When they can't say that something Trump has said is false, they just say it's misleading. Well, that's interesting. Like, if you're a fact checker, you should probably just say whether something is true or false, or if it's ambiguous, or if you can't really say. But I feel like you should reserve statements like Trump is misleading for only when you can really make a convincing case of that. Here Trump is saying that, first he's giving his opinion on solicited versus unsolicited ballots, and that's whatever, that's his opinion. And then he's saying that there's fraud. Well, if there is some fraud happening, or if you don't know how much fraud is happening, then I don't see how you can say it's misleading. The New York Times, is going to say that, well, actually, most states don't have unsolicited ballots. There are only 5 states that do have unsolicited ballots. And they're going to kind of clarify that, and the fraud we know about is pretty limited. Only one of those states is a battleground state. So it's, they're saying it's misleading, and yeah, maybe it is. Like, maybe Trump is trying to convey to the viewer that, hey, there's a whole bunch of fraud, there's a lot of fraud, the election is ruined because of mail-in ballots. Maybe he's trying to say that. But if you just look at the quote and what they're, representing here, well, is it false? The New York Times doesn't make the case that this is literally false. So I don't see why they say it's misleading. There's fraud. Trump is saying that there is fraud. He's not saying that every vote is fraudulent. So I would say this is true. It may not lead to the conclusion that you think is best, but if it's not false and there is some evidence for it, I guess it's true. And the same thing is going to apply to this one. This next one refers to a moment in Joe Biden's speech where he was seemingly insulting the military at a speech. Trump says it's on tape. And the New York Times says, oh, this is misleading. And they go on to say, I don't want to repeat this remark here because I feel it's crude, but they go on to say that, Joe Biden did say this and it is on tape, but he's trying for an applause line that did not quite land. I've seen this video, and I think that's an apt description that Biden is trying for an applause line that did not land. He's giving a speech to the military, and he says this thing about them when they don't clap for whatever it is he's talking about. But I think it's pretty obviously in jest and not serious. And I don't think any military members walked away from that believing that Biden had insulted them or was trying to insult them. But still, I mean, it is a simple fact that this did happen, and it happened pretty much like Trump said it happened. And still, rather than just say, well, it's true, they say it's misleading. And, here I think, yeah, maybe it is misleading a bit. You're trying to make people think that Biden, hates the military. But it's also just factually true. It did happen exactly like Trump said, and it is on tape, and you can watch it. So, again, I feel the New York Times is kind of overstepping to criticize Trump and say that, no, this is misleading, when in fact it's not. When in fact it's true. If you are playing the role of a fact checker, you shouldn't be weighing in rhetorically. You shouldn't be trying to convince the audience of an argument. And I feel you are trying to do that when you just say that everything Trump says is misleading. This is true. Biden did say this about the military, or about some members of the military. Biden probably wasn't serious. He didn't mean it as an insult. It was just a kind of off-color joke or quip in his speech, trying for an applause line that did not land. But it is true. The next point, they say, a quote from Mr. Trump, "It was driving energy prices through the sky." And this is in response to a question they gave Trump about why he rolled back the Clean Power Plan. And Trump said it was driving energy prices through the sky. That's why he rolled it back. The New York Times rates this claim as false. And they say it's false because, in fact, most of the Clean Power Plan was never implemented. It was temporarily halted by a 2016 Supreme Court order and never reinstated before the Trump administration effectively rolled it back last year. I looked this up, and there's an article in Scientific American about this plan, the Clean Power Plan. And what Scientific American has to say about it is that, Trump says it's going to cause a skyrocketing electricity bills. In truth, that's hard to show. The experts disagree about whether the Clean Power Plan would influence power costs. Trump is citing experts that say it would, and his experts are from NERA, N-E-R-A, Economic Consulting, which is funded by which is funded by, I don't see it here, but it's funded by a kind of coal or gas lobby. So Trump is citing experts that are probably biased against the Clean Power Plan. And then supporters of the Clean Power Plan point to other studies that say it's actually going to save money. The US EPA and EIA came somewhere in between, estimating that electricity prices would rise at first and fall later. And the EPA thought they'd be lower than without having the rule by 2030. So in other words, it's kind of contentious as to what people thought this plan would do to power prices. Some people thought it would increase power prices. Some people thought it would decrease them. Some people thought they'd go up at first and then down. But I think really the obvious answer, and the answer that if you know anything about making massive changes to the economy or making predictions about the economy, we don't know. If we knew what effect things would have, then we would always make very good choices. Nobody would intentionally decide to, let's hurt the economy, let's damage the economy, let's raise electricity prices. The fact is, there is inherent ambiguity about saying what these major plans will do to prices in the future. We don't know the future. And for systems as complicated as the energy market and our economy generally, we just can't say, what my set of legislation is going to do to that really complicated system 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future. The experts disagree, and they have different opinions. So, again, it's odd to me to say it's false. They asked him, hey, why'd you cancel this plan? And Trump says, it was driving energy prices through the sky. They go, false. It was actually mostly not implemented. So are they just coming at Trump because he phrased it as if the plan was already driving energy prices through the sky? Mr. President, it hadn't been implemented yet. So you have the wrong verb tense. That's false. Like, is that what the New York Times is doing? Or are they trying to say that, well, actually, Mr. President, there are these kind of conflicting expert opinions as to whether or not it would or wouldn't change prices by, different amounts. Either way, I think it's pretty unfair. If they are saying that, you use the wrong verb tense, it actually would have driven energy prices through the sky, is what you should have said. They're being too harsh on Trump if that's their reasoning. And if their alternate reason is that they don't think it would have driven energy prices up, well, there you're just being you are being too harsh, because you are believing that you can see the future and you know what it would have done to energy prices. Whereas I don't think there's any reason to suspect that the New York Times has that expertise. So again, they're being way too hard on Trump, in my opinion. The next quote: take a look at what happened in Manhattan. Take a look at what happened in New Jersey. They're losing 30 and 40%. It's a fraud. And this is said by Mr. Trump. It's in the context of mail-in ballots, and Trump is saying they're losing 30 to 40%. The New York Times rates it as partly true, partly exaggerated. And here they kind of explain that, in Manhattan, in local elections there, they did reject 3,200 ballots, or 19% of those cast, but not just for claims of suspicion or fraud, but also because of user error or mismatched signatures, things like that. Although, note that Trump didn't say all of the ballots that were rejected due to fraud. He just said, they're rejecting a lot of them. They're rejecting 30 to 40%, and that it's fraud. And the New York Times, as I read it, is somewhat agreeing. They're saying it's not just for claims or suspicion of fraud, which implies to me that there was some of that. But the New York Times is saying, 19%. So here I feel like this is a fair call by the New York Times. It's not 30 to 40%. I'm basing my information off of what's written in the New York Times. So it's not 30 to 40%. It's apparently 19%. Okay, it's partly true, partly exaggerated. I think that's a fair call. I think it's nice to give him partly true for this because, numerically he's not correct, but directionally he's right. I think that there's substantial problems with mail-in voting in this particular election. If you're losing 19% of the ballots due to fraud or suspicion of fraud or user error, that seems like a pretty substantial problem to me. Although exaggerating it to 40% is too much, an overstatement. The next one: today there was a big problem. In Philadelphia, they went in to watch. They're called poll watchers. It's a very safe, very nice thing. They were thrown out. They weren't allowed to watch. The New York Times says this is exaggerated. But they go on to explain that Trump is talking about a group of supporters, a group of Trump supporters, who weren't allowed to watch an election inside of some satellite election offices in Philadelphia. So they were thrown out because it's not legal in Philadelphia for Trump supporters to watch an election. I understand that there are laws prohibiting, advocacy groups from interfering in or seeming to influence or even just potentially observing elections. I understand that, and that makes some sense to me. I don't think you should let partisans have too much influence over the voting process itself. Perhaps that's going to influence voters, or perhaps it's going to intimidate some people if they go in to vote and they see 20 guys with Trump signs maybe a few people will be less likely to vote or less likely to go in and vote for Biden or something. So I think it's a fair call to say those people can't be in the Philadelphia voting booths or offices or area. But what I don't think is fair is to say that it's exaggerated. If Trump is just literally saying that his poll watchers were thrown out, and they were thrown out because they aren't allowed to watch, and that's what Trump is saying, how can you say that's exaggerated? It's literally true. It's the thing that you are saying happened also. Like the next two paragraphs of the New York Times article just kind of agree that that's exactly what happened. Trump supporters went and were kicked out because it's not legal. They weren't legally allowed to be inside. Like the New York Times, is saying this is exaggerated because they think, and I think probably correctly, that Trump is trying to, say like, oh, the system is biased against me. They aren't letting my guys, watch. And the New York Times is saying, well, that's kind of exaggerated, Trump. And yeah, I mean, maybe like the conclusion doesn't feel right to the New York Times. Like the idea that people might get from hearing this, that doesn't seem right to the New York Times. But this just goes back to what I was saying before about if you're a fact checker, you really can't be like getting into the rhetoric of it and saying like, well, we don't want people to see this fact and then believe something, so we're going to say it's exaggerated or that the fact is wrong. I don't think so. I think, what I know about this situation comes from the New York Times, comes from these two paragraphs, and it seems like it's literally true. I think you have to call this true if you're going to call yourself a fact checker. The next point, they're sending millions of ballots all over the country. There's frauds. They found them in creeks. This has exactly the same problem. Trump says it. The New York Times says this is exaggerated. And then they go on in their subsequent paragraphs to talk about how basically this exactly happened. They are sending millions of ballots all over the country for mail-in voting. And there is some examples of ballots being found in creeks, or some examples of what you could call fraud. At least you could certainly say it's being investigated as fraud. Ballots found thrown out or thrown in creeks. So again, like the New York Times is just kind of, I'd say, like pathologically resistant to calling a Trump statement true. The facts of it are true, but rather than just say true, they say it's exaggerated. And then in their explanatory paragraphs, they just talk about how, there were ballots found in a garbage can, or there were ballots, 3 trays of mail lying in a ditch along a highway. There were these ballots found, by the creek, or a ditch, I suppose. So, like, why say it's exaggerated? Or why call yourself a fact checker if you're just going to take facts from Trump and say that they're exaggerated when they're true? It's frustrating for me. So in this next one, the quote from Mr. Trump again is, every year I get the call, California is burning, California is burning. If that was cleaned, if you had forest management, you wouldn't be getting those calls. The New York Times says that this is false. And so this is in response to Mr. Wallace's question about human pollution, gas and greenhouse gases contributing to global warming. But really what Trump is talking about here is the fires in California. Maybe you have a better argument for actually, Trump, your statement doesn't quite touch on the theme of the moderator's question. Maybe that would be a better response than false. But like just what Trump is saying here, I think there's potentially a significant amount of truth to it. I think it's debatable, at least. So like the problem with California wildfires is that for a long time, forest management has suppressed kind of the natural trend of forest fires in California's land. And they've suppressed it. They've suppressed a lot of small fires, and that's led to the buildup of brush and debris and dead wood in these forests and millions of acres of forests in California, and the buildup of all that unburnt forest leads to the potential of greater and greater conflagrations as time goes on. I think certainly global warming is a contributor to this, but I think it's also pretty obviously the case that forest management is a contributor to this as well, in that forest management might be things like cleaning up the brush and the dead wood, or forest management might be something like controlled burns, so that you eliminate the buildup of forest that needs to burn, and you prevent the larger and larger conflagrations that are currently being experienced in the West Coast. And so the New York Times is going to go on, this assessment proves that humans are the dominant cause of the global temperature rise. Sure, but that's not related, that is related to forest fires, but it's not like directly falsifying Trump. It's not saying that forest management couldn't stop the problematic forest fires. While the New York Times does say, well, forest management does play some role, there are direct links between climate change and worsening wildfires. So I don't think you can really say, though, that if climate change weren't happening, there wouldn't be major forest fires in California. I think there would be if the forest management problem still existed. I think you can certainly say that climate change is making the fires worse, but that doesn't disprove what Trump is saying. Forest management may still be able to contain or mitigate or prevent the annual California fires that require such massive intervention. So it just seems unfair to say it's false, because I don't even know what they're trying to say is false. Is California burning every year? Yeah, I think that's true. If it was cleaned, or if there was better forest management, you wouldn't need federal intervention. I think that's at least potentially true. And I mean, it's certainly more of an argument than the New York Times makes to say that, that's not entirely false. Their explanatory paragraphs are just kind of dedicated to the idea of global warming. And then at the end here, they're like, yeah, forest management could play a role in wildfires. They don't really even touch on or try to rebut Trump's thesis here. They just say it's false. The next one, excuse me, Portland. The sheriff just came out today and he said, I support President Trump. And that's a quote from President Trump. And here they call that false. And I think it is fair to say that is false. To the best of my knowledge, the Portland sheriff did not come out and say, I support President Trump. So, yep, that seems false. They clarify he may have been talking about, there was some other police officer who was in Portland who said, I support Trump or something like that. But it wasn't the sheriff, so false. This next one I like because we're going back to Biden, and it's giving us an example of the disparity between Trump and Biden. So the quote from Biden, his own Homeland Security director, and as well as the FBI director, says there is no evidence at all that mail-in ballots are a source of being manipulated and cheating. The New York Times says this is mostly true. And I love the first sentence of their explanatory paragraph. Though Mr. Trump's Homeland Security Secretary, Chad Wolf, has not made this assertion. Like, what? The first line, his Homeland Security Director says this. And the first sentence of the explanation, okay, he didn't make this assertion. Like, what are you talking about? These are the two different standards to which Trump and Biden are being held. Trump says something, and they look for any way that they can interpret what he said to say, aha, it's false, it's mostly false, it's exaggerated, it's misleading. Whatever Biden says, they look for any way they can stretch to say it's true. Oh, it's mostly true. Biden says his Homeland Security Director says there's no evidence at all that mail-in ballots are a source of being manipulated and cheating. That's mostly true. Okay, the Homeland Security Secretary hasn't made that assertion, but other people did. I think you just have to ask yourself, if this was a statement that Trump had made, if Trump had said that Obama's Homeland Security Director said X, and the fact was that Obama's Homeland Security Director did not make that assertion, I think you have to ask yourself, would the New York Times call Trump's statement mostly true? Or would they say that actually the Homeland Security Director never said X, so that's false? I think at this point in reading, we know the answer to that. So in the next one, Trump says, almost everything I see is from the left wing. That's Mr. Trump. And that's when he's talking about the violence between left-wing protesters and white supremacists and others fighting in the recent riots and protests kind of around the country. And so they say this is misleading. And I think it's interesting that they don't go even further than that. If you're going to be biased, and if you're going to let rhetoric influence your fact checking as much as they clearly are at the New York Times, why not just go ahead and call this false? I don't know. I think it's interesting that they're restraining themselves a bit, but it's hard to me. It's hard for me to see a justification for saying it's misleading. It doesn't reach the conclusion that the New York Times would want, but it's like Trump giving his opinion. So when Trump is talking about the violence at the protests, he's saying that from his perspective, everything I see is from the left wing. Almost everything I see is from the left wing. So, maybe you could argue that, if you had some way to represent the facts and figures of who's doing the violence, maybe you could make that case and say that, Trump's perspective is poor, or that, factually Trump is wrong. Most of the violence isn't being done by left-wing people. But I just don't think there's any way to know that numerically or quantitatively. You have Antifa and armed militia groups that are kind of out in the streets fighting each other in some instances. And, you can't run around and give these people surveys and ask, were you a victim of violence? Did you commit violence? And where do you fall on the political spectrum? If you see a guy in a mask punching, another guy on the street, it's difficult to know what the political alignment of the people are. And it's difficult to know how many punches happened and how many rocks were thrown or whatever. I would just say you can't really assess this, or this isn't a fact. This is Trump saying what he sees, and you can agree with that or disagree with that. Or maybe you could make some argument about actually more violence is coming from the left or right, but it feels wrong to me, or it feels like an overstatement to say that this is misleading. The next one is similar to one we've seen before. It's a quote from Trump. They cheat. They found ballots in a waste paper basket 3 days ago. They all had the name, and they all had the name military ballots. They were military. They all had the name Trump on them. So Trump is talking about, another instance where Trump ballots were found in the trash as an example of kind of fraud or the weakness of the mail-in voting system. They say it's exaggerated, but in their explanation, they talk about exactly the case that Trump described. There were 9 ballots where they were thrown away. At least 7 of the ballots were cast for Mr. Trump. At least 7. So I think it could be the case that all of them were for Trump. So, Trump is saying they all had the name Trump on them. And if they're saying the claim is exaggerated because it was actually only 7 of 9, which were definitely Trump ballots. Again, I just have to go back to well, what was that case where, I have to go back to Biden says Trump's Homeland Security Director said there's no evidence of mail-in fraud. And they say that's mostly true. Oh, Trump's Homeland Security Director didn't make this assertion? Still mostly true. And later Trump is saying, the ballots all had the name Trump on them. And they say that's exaggerated. Only 7 out of 9 of the ballots we know had the name Trump on them. The other 2 might have had a different name, although it's unknown what name the other 2 had. The investigation is ongoing. So, in some sense it's exaggerated because maybe Trump is trying to give this as an example of there's so much widespread problems with mail-in voting. And I think it would be fair to say, well, actually 9 ballots is not a widespread problem. But it's not fair to say that a literal fact is exaggerated. Or, Trump is saying what happened. And the fact checkers, who you would hope would just be kind of arbiters and tell you if things are facts or not, they're saying it's exaggerated. When, it happened. And it happened more or less as Trump described it. Why not give this a mostly true? Or if if this is the standard that you are going to apply, if you're the New York Times, why not say that Biden's claim earlier was exaggerated too? It's the double standard of Biden gets mostly true for when they kind of know what he means, and Trump gets exaggerated for there was some, technical glitch in what you said. It wasn't 9 of 9, it was at least 7 of 9. Or it's not actually as big of a problem as you're implying, so it's exaggerated. In my view, this should be true or mostly true. The next one, I think, is again going to be similar. A quote from Trump. It says, "I want crystal clean water and air. I want beautiful clean air. We have the lowest carbon. Look at our numbers now. We are doing phenomenal." And they say it's misleading. And so this was, again, they're talking about the environment, obviously, and they're talking about rolling back some Obama-era regulations relating to the environment. And Trump gives this answer. So I think they tend to do this. They kind of put 3 or 4 ideas into a fact check. And it's not exactly clear which of these ideas they are contesting. So obviously, I guess they can't be contesting that Trump wants crystal clean water and air or beautiful air. So, I guess they're contesting this idea. We have the lowest carbon. Look at our numbers now. We're doing phenomenal. It's hard to know what we have the lowest carbon really quite means. And so it's hard to say that it's misleading. What do you mean we have the lowest carbon? But in their explanatory text, the New York Times says, "It is accurate that the United States' carbon dioxide emissions have fallen slightly in recent years, but they are expected to increase in coming years." So it's it's hard to know what Trump means, but there's apparently a way where you can say, well, actually the United States does have low carbon dioxide emissions, or decreasing carbon dioxide emissions. They've fallen slightly in recent years. But they're expected by the New York Times to increase in coming years. So, again, why is this misleading? Okay, we have the lowest carbon. Maybe it's not quite lowest. But if our carbon dioxide emissions are decreasing, and that's what Trump said, why would you dispute that? I guess in some sense, I have to commend the New York Times for providing the explanatory text that I think disputes their misleading, or their the kind of appellation they give to each of these facts that they're checking. But in another sense, I have to condemn the New York Times for the appellations that they are giving. So they're saying this fact is misleading. And I doubt people will kind of read the rest of the description and take the time to think about it to the extent required to realize how dishonest the New York Times is being, or how inconsistent, may be a better word, how they're applying a double standard and being pretty harsh on Trump and pretty lenient with Biden. And one reason why I say that is just because when I read this article the first time, I didn't quite get the same vibe or the same feeling that I have now. Now on rereading it and on presenting it and talking about it, I'm feeling even more strongly that the New York Times is being dishonest, because I've already had this, few minutes to see their paragraphs and think about what they mean and realize that, they are really overstating the case against Trump, even compared to their own explanations. And again, I haven't really done like research to contest the New York Times. I'm using their own explanations and their own research and their own facts. I'm pretty convinced, just from my experience doing things like this before, that if I were to take the time and really dig into these, or if I were to put on the Trump advocate hat, I'm pretty convinced I could make a much stronger case against what the New York Times is saying than what I can do just by looking at the information from the New York Times. But in some sense, I don't even need to. I have a problem with every fact check so far. Almost everyone, I think. I think there was one I agreed with. But I have a problem with almost every fact check so far, just with the information that the New York Times provides. And so the next one, the fact is I've gone head-to-head with Putin and made it clear to him we're not going to take any of his stuff. He's Putin's puppy. He still refuses to even say anything to Putin about the bounty on the heads of American soldiers. And the New York Times says that's true. That's what Mr. Biden said about Mr. Trump. He's Putin's puppy. Is the New York Times saying that's true? No, I take it that the New York Times is saying Trump still refuses to even say anything to Putin about the bounty on the heads of American soldiers. But actually, if you look it up, Trump says that this didn't happen. Trump says that one, he didn't know about it while it was allegedly happening. Trump says that the information didn't rise to his level because intelligence agencies and analysts had dismissed it as not true. And to my knowledge, there's not confirmation that it is true. It's alleged that Russians offered bounties for American soldiers, but not proven. And so, the point that you didn't confront Putin about this. Well, if Trump thinks it's not true, why would he confront Putin about this? Again, it's an example of a double standard. I feel like if the roles were reversed and Trump was saying that, oh, you didn't do X, Biden, and Biden didn't think X was a problem, I don't think the New York Times would say that was true for President Trump. I think they'd say this is misleading. It's misleading because Biden is saying it as if, the conclusion that Biden wants you to draw is that Trump is a Russian puppet. And that's the conclusion that the New York Times wants you to draw. But I think a more fair conclusion would be that the extent of Russian involvement is disputed. And Trump doesn't agree that the Russians put contracts on American soldiers. Or Trump may agree that that happened, and he may not think that the best thing to do is escalate it to diplomatic interactions. And I realize escalating it might be a weird word to use there, but if you just think about the reality of it, if we were going to say that yes, Russians did pay Afghanis or Iraqis to kill American servicemen, if we were going to make that public, that is an escalation between the United States and Russia. And I think it's fair for the president to consider, from the diplomatic perspective, whether we want that escalation to be public or not. I think that's kind of exactly the decision we want the president to be making. I think a lot of people are kind of conditioned to think of American military involvement as being only against the kind of powerless countries that we've been recently fighting, like Afghanistan or Iraq, where the people of these countries and the governments of these countries have no recourse to American intervention, and we can do and say whatever we like. But Russia isn't one of those countries. They're a nuclear-armed pseudo-superpower. They have the ability to, in the absolute worst case, take us to World War III or global annihilation. And so, obviously a lot more care has to go into diplomatic and strategic and military considerations when it comes to Russia. And maybe we don't want to be saying things like, you killed our guys, now we're going to kill yours. Maybe we don't want to have those escalations in public. I think it's certainly the case that if Russia were putting bounties on American soldiers' heads, that the United States would need to respond in some way. But I don't think it's the case that we need to make it public. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that really there are two explanations from the Trump side of things. One is, didn't happen. There's not proof of this. It's contested. I don't think it happened. That's why I didn't confront Putin. And the second one is, I don't want to make the confrontation with Russia public right now because I want to try to wind this down. I don't want to escalate with Russia. I want to resolve things. The next one, I'm okay with electric cars too. I'm all for electric cars. I've given big incentives for electric cars. That's a quote from Trump. The New York Times calls it mostly false. So this one, a bit hard for me to come to grips with. The key reason the New York Times calls this false is because Trump actually hasn't added any new big incentives for electric cars. And in fact, he's proposed eliminating the incentives that are there. But if I were going to, put on my MAGA hat again, I would say that while Trump hasn't added any new incentives for electric cars, there still exists the $2,500 to $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles, which is an incentive for electric cars. It is a subsidy, and it does exist in the Trump administration. So, I'm just kind of grappling with how the New York Times reconciles those facts that I just said, that there is a government subsidy for electric cars, and that you could certainly construe that as a big incentive for electric cars, that those subsidies currently exist, how they reconcile that fact with calling Trump's statement false. I don't know, I'm kind of at a loss to even explain how they do that. They think, I guess, that, Trump didn't invent those subsidies, which is true, but he didn't remove them either. And his administration continues to, uphold and pay those incentives out. And I know they can't be contesting, I'm okay with electric cars. You can't soothsay Trump's opinions on electric cars or whether he's for them or not. And he is currently giving the incentives. They may dispute, will he give the incentives in the future? I think that's up for debate. But he says he has given them. And I have to say, that is true. Again, by their explanation. Maybe they could make a better case maybe for being misleading, or maybe for being mostly true, with the caveats being, Trump didn't create this incentive. He wasn't the first person to add this incentive, and that he's kind of arguing for eliminating it right now. But again, ask yourselves, if the roles were reversed, would the New York Times be this generous or this harsh for Biden if Biden had been saying, the equivalent claim? Then we have, they want to take out the cows, as another quote from Mr. Trump. It's false. So this is a reference to the Green New Deal, which Trump was misleadingly referring to, according to the New York Times. But if you look at what Trump was alluding to was a document that was posted on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's website. There was kind of an FAQ about the Green New Deal. And on that, they have a quote that says, "We aren't sure that we'll be able to fully get rid of farting cows and airplanes that fast," when they're talking about their 10-year timeline. It is, again, hard for me to even explain how the New York Times can call this false when Trump is talking about the Green New Deal, which I guess is misleading because Biden isn't necessarily supporting the Green New Deal or isn't an adherent or proponent of it. So in some sense, that's misleading. But I think at that point, Trump was talking about the Green New Deal, and more broadly, he's talking about the wing of the Democratic Party that supports the Green New Deal and those ideas. And Trump is talking about the concern that that party will have significant influence on Biden and the policies of Biden's administration. And that might be represented by Kamala Harris and her pretty prominent role in the Biden administration. All that said, okay, the Green New Deal, in I don't want to say blog post, but in a document that was put up too early and wasn't ready, did make the case that, hey, we want to get rid of cows. We're not ready to do that within 10 years. And maybe they were being tongue-in-cheek about that or something. But even if you were to look up the text of the Green New Deal, which unfortunately I wish I had done this in advance. But if you were to look up the text of the Green New Deal, they actually do make reference to working with ranchers to reduce emissions as much as possible. And of course, a major source of emissions that ranchers deal with is the methane exuded from cows. So it basically is not misleading, in my opinion, it's not false, in my opinion, to say that, to say that the Green New Deal has a goal of getting rid of cows. Maybe that's extreme or it's an exaggeration, but it's stated in the Green New Deal FAQ, although admittedly a draft of it, or an unready version of it. In the officially published Green New Deal, this is from the congress.gov website, they do refer to working with farmers and ranchers collaboratively in the United States to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural sector as much as is technologically feasible, including by, and they list a few things, and one of them is building a more sustainable food system that ensures universal access to healthy foods. So if you're a rancher and you're told, hey, we're going to reduce greenhouse gases by building a more sustainable food system, and you see language like this in the Green New Deal FAQ on the website of one of the authors of the Green New Deal, we want to get rid of cows. We aren't sure we'll be able to get rid of cows that fast. it's not insane to draw the conclusion that they want to get rid of cows. They want to take out the cows, as Trump said. That is not that's not as crazy a conclusion as it might seem at first. Maybe it's misleading because, Biden doesn't agree with the Green New Deal. But, in the context of that moment, they were clearly talking about the Green New Deal. And Biden had the opportunity to say that he didn't agree with it and he didn't want the Green New Deal. So, again, false is, it's an overreach, I think, by far. I think, let me just see how many of these I'm going to do. Okay, I'll just go, I have 3 more left that I'll talk about. The next one, somebody has to do something about Antifa and the left. This is not a right-wing problem, this is left-wing. And that's a quote from Trump. He's talking about the violence, again, between the left-wing Antifa and other, I suppose, in Trump's parlance, other people doing the fighting with them. And the New York Times says it's misleading. They say that, the FBI director is pointing to racially motivated violent extremism, mostly from white supremacists. Okay, well, Trump isn't talking about racially motivated violence. He's talking about the violence that's happening in these street protests. Trump is pretty clearly talking about the kind of political violence, or the looting and the rioting and the burning or the blocking of city streets, the kind of behavior that's been happening in Portland and Minneapolis and other cities. So I don't know if you can necessarily call it racially motivated violent extremism, which I think, kind of by that definition, sure, that makes sense that it's mostly from white supremacists. But I also don't know how you can say, the violence that Trump is talking about, it's not a left-leaning problem. It's not a problem from Antifa and the left. Well, I think a lot of the protesters would likely agree that they aren't right-wingers. If you were to look at the people doing the looting and the burning and the rioting in the cities in the U.S., and you were to just pick, 100 of them, and you were to ask them, hey, are you voting for Trump? Or hey, are you a right-wing person? My intuition is that very few of them would say yes. So again, I would say this is not even a fact, really. This is Trump's opinion. It's his perspective. It's something that's not really quantifiable. It's something you can't really know. We don't know what their political positions are. We don't know, to what extent the violence is a left-wing or right-wing problem. And I think that would be a huge debate, because if I were a left-wing person and I heard someone say this, then what I would say is a lot of the protesters or a lot of the people being violent are left-wing in some sense. But they are evincing that violence, and they are having this reaction as a response to right-wing people. So we wouldn't be burning down your buildings if there weren't a problem with the right-wing police state. A left-wing person might make that argument in response, and then you're going to have, kind of a back and forth and a philosophical or a political debate to kind of untangle it. And the point I'm trying to get at is that it's not a fact that you can just easily reduce to true, false, misleading, exaggerated. This is kind of a sentence that opens up a chasm of debate that you can go into. And I think it would be worth it to have that debate and talk about those things. I don't think it's worth it. I don't think it's honest to take this one sentence and just say, misleading, false. Or true, for that matter. I don't think this is really a fact that you can, just slap the label on. This next one, we left him a booming economy. and he caused the recession. That was said by Mr. Biden. The New York Times calls it false. They explain that the economy wasn't booming. To be honest, I didn't peer too closely at this one, mainly because it kind of fit my intuitions or my first impressions. And also, I kind of felt like if they're going to call a Biden statement false, then it probably is false. So I don't need to gainsay them here. But I guess the kind of the big problem for me is realizing that this one, we left him a booming economy and he caused the recession. In some sense, maybe like an extremely significant lie. And the New York Times has put this at the 20th, the 20th spot in their list. So, why I say it's the most significant lie is because the economy is kind of a huge fact of life. It influences the lives of hundreds of millions of Americans, countless people worldwide. It influences your life in the sense that if the economy is doing well, you're more likely to earn more money or to have better investments or retirement accounts. There are more opportunities available to you. You can buy goods and services at lower prices and so on. And so if you're saying we had a booming economy, you're saying something really significant about the world and about your performance as a member of the executive branch. So you're making this really important and major claim about reality. And you're wrong. So, actually, it wasn't booming. As the New York Times points out, Trump did not cause the pandemic recession. So, in some sense, this is a huge lie and really significant because, the economy is important to a lot of voters. And so if you're going to say, hey, we're good with the economy, we had a booming economy, Trump had a recession, those two facts are both wrong, and they both mean a huge amount. And you put it as the 20th item in your list of facts. You put it below, these kind of quips about they want to get rid of cows and things like that. And it's super important, and you buried it. So, I don't have a problem with how the New York Times labeled this one, but I do have a problem that this is the 20th fact in their list of fact checking. And yeah, they treat it very unseriously for how significant it is. So, not all these facts are created equal. I think I've made that point. Not all these facts are created equal. And so when you kind of reduce it to this points or gamesmanship where you're just really finely parsing what Trump says and inventing ways to, you were misleading here, you're false here, minus one, wrong, false, exaggerated, misleading. And yeah, Biden lied about the economy. He lied about Trump causing the recession, and those matter a ton. But it's kind of equally weighted here against all of the other kind of highly disputed and debatable pseudo facts that the New York Times is going to list. It bothers me, and it bothers me more kind of the more I think about it or the more I talk about it. So just the last one I'll do here, in part because it's the last one I've read, and in part because my voice is kind of getting tired of talking. The quote from the New York Times, this is the quote from Trump that the New York Times is evaluating. It says, one of the reasons I'll have so many judges, because President Obama and him left me 128 judges to fill. They left 128 openings. That's from Mr. Trump. And the New York Times verdict is that this statement is misleading. Again, I kind of want to scream in frustration. If I could scream loud enough for Cheryl Gay Stolberg, the New York Times reporter, to hear me, I might do it. Because even the first sentence of their explanatory text is, while it is true that Mr. Trump had vacancies to fill. Okay, if it's true, then why are you calling it misleading? The reason they're going to go on to call it misleading is that the reason that these vacancies existed is because the Republican-controlled Senate didn't confirm any of Barack Obama's positions, appointments. So Obama couldn't get anybody confirmed, and so he had to leave a bunch of positions vacant, and then Trump came in and filled them. Okay. It's still true. It's still true that there were 128 vacancies, I assume, and Trump filled them. Obama didn't fill them, and Trump did. And you go, but the Republican Senate, they prevented Obama from doing it. Okay, well, now you're explaining the fact, but an explanation for a fact doesn't make it wrong, and it doesn't make it misleading. Trump's point is Obama and Biden couldn't fill these openings, and the fact is they couldn't fill them. And if you say, well, it's because they had a Republican Senate, sure, but they could have made deals with the Republican Senate. They could have ran their administration in such a way that they didn't get a Republican Senate. When Obama first won the election, he had majorities in the House and the Senate, and people's kind of reaction to Obama's government style was such that the House and the Senate reverted to Republican control. So, okay, if you had governed differently or led differently, maybe people wouldn't have voted your opposition into the other parties or into the other parts of government so overwhelmingly that you weren't able to get anything done. And like the Republican contingent of government kind of hated Obama or had such strong antipathy to Obama that they weren't willing or able to work with him. And, Obama is not entirely absolved of blame in that regard. He's not a king. He's not a dictator. He's a politician, and he's supposed to be political or make deals or get things done. Or, if he can't do that, take responsibility for what he couldn't get done. And in this case, what he couldn't get done is filling 128 vacancies. Maybe he could have done that by going to McConnell and saying, hey, we'll make a deal. I'll put in 60 Republicans, 60 Democrat judges. Maybe he could have done it by governing in such a way that McConnell didn't have the authority to, or didn't have the mandate from the public to reject Obama. Or, who knows what he could have done. But this is kind of similar to what I meant before about opening this chasm of debate. There's all this stuff we could talk about here. And the New York Times just sums it up as, this is misleading. Well, if we're allowed to make this argument, I could take any statement that Joe Biden said and, kind of wax poetic for a little while and then say, it's misleading because you didn't think about X, Y, and Z. But I never noticed them applying the same harsh standard to to Biden that they applied to Donald Trump. And it bothers me. So, as I mentioned, that's the last one I read. No, that's not true. I think I read all of them. But it's the last one I'm going to talk about. This is kind of an unedited video, just kind of top of mind. I didn't really do too much preparation for this, but I'm hoping it still works out as a video. And one reason why I hope it still works out is because, one reason why I haven't been making YouTube videos is because it takes some effort, basically, to research and record and edit the videos. But if it works out to, just take something top of mind and put it into a video, kind of one shot like this, it's certainly a lot easier than some of the other methods I've been doing. And so my reason for just bringing that up or just saying that here is to say that, if you enjoyed this video, let me know by clicking the like button, say something in the comments. And that'll kind of let me know that, hey, this is an okay way to make a video, or this is still a valuable way to make a video, and people are interested in seeing this, and maybe I can make more in this style, where I just pick something off the top of my mind and talk about it for a little while. And yeah, if you want to see more videos like this, you can go ahead and subscribe. Although I can't promise, that I'll make. I can't promise the frequency of videos that I will make. I haven't made any in some time. But just after watching the presidential debate and reading this article in the New York Times, I felt kind of agitated enough. I had something to say, and I wanted to kind of get it off my chest. So yeah, I guess that's a long way of saying click the like button, say something in the comments, and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.